Hello, welcome to Honors Biology Unit 3, Homeostasis and Cell Transport. Let's begin with our lecture today. Here we go. Now, homeostasis. Well, what does that word mean? So this chapter is about homeostasis and transport. Well, cell transport has to do with how things move, and we're going to be talking about that a lot in this unit. We're going to be talking about how things move passively and how that's what we're going to talk about first, which means without energy. We're going to talk about how things move with energy. That's called active transport. Homeostasis, what does that mean? Homeostasis also means this word equilibrium. So homeostasis is a balanced environment. Okay, so let's first begin, and then we're going to discuss how homeostasis comes into play. Diffusion, here's the first term. Things diffuse in nature. What does that mean? They move from where there's a lot or a high concentration to an area where there's less or a low concentration. We can think of it as high concentration, low concentration. It's kind of like going downhill, and rolling a ball downhill, for example, would not take any energy. So diffusion is a passive type of transport, meaning no energy is required in the movement. Why is diffusion an important concept to understand? Well, because this is how most things move in nature and within our bodies. They move by diffusing from one area to another. So they go from where there's a little bit, where there's a lot, to areas that there is none or there is a little bit. So a high concentration, this is showing you a drop of dye put in pure water, and then that drop of dye diffuses in all directions until it reaches a point where it is evenly distributed. When it reaches the point where everything is even throughout, it has reached equilibrium, or you could say homeostasis. So the key factor is, why do things diffuse? They move in order to balance themselves out. And when they do that, when they eventually balance themselves out, they reach equilibrium or homeostasis. Now, here's another picture showing you a bunch of, this could be dye similar to this one, and then it diffuses in all directions, and boom, when everything is moving in all directions, you now have equilibrium. Okay, so diffusion, what is the purpose of diffusion? For molecules or particles to move and reach equilibrium or homeostasis. Now, a term you may see, a concentration gradient. This means a concentration difference. So things go from a high concentration to a low concentration. We almost think of it as moving downhill or down the concentration gradient. So if you ever see the term going down a concentration gradient, it is going downhill, it requires no energy, and that is passive transport, and diffusion would be an example of that. Osmosis. Now, osmosis, this is a specialized kind of diffusion. All right. It is not just diffusion, it is the diffusion of water. And this is showing you a picture here. This picture shows you the little water molecules are these little blue dots. And over here, these green ones are a type of sugar called sucrose. So this is a sucrose or sugar solution with water and sugar. And this is a bunch of water over here. Okay. So osmosis is the diffusion of water diffusing across a semi-permeable membrane, which means not everything can cross the membrane, all right? Or selectively permeable, not everything can cross this membrane. In this case, only things that are small enough are able to cross the membrane. So in this picture, water is small, water can diffuse through the membrane. Sugar or sucrose, these green things, they're too big. They cannot pass the membrane. So the membrane is not permeable to sugar or sucrose in this picture here. They cannot fit through these tiny pores, all right? So this membrane is permeable to only water. So what happens? Water moves from where there is a lot or a high concentration of water to an area that has a lower concentration of water. So in this example, in this picture, the water molecules diffuse across the membrane in order to balance out the area here that has a lower concentration of water, okay? So in essence, the sugar dissolved in the water is pulling the water, the pure water, towards it in order to balance it out. So the whole idea is water is diffusing, so no energy, passive transport, is moving from where there's a lot of water to where there's a lower concentration of water. What is decreasing the concentration of water over here? All of the sugar dissolved in the water is decreasing the amount of water in comparison to this side. So over here, let's say we have 100% water, and over here, let's say we have 50% water. The water is moving from 100% water to an area of 50% water. The sugar is dissolved in the water, and the sugar is called a solute, all right? And this whole area over here, because the solute is dissolved, the sugar is dissolved in the water, this is called a solution, okay? Now, this says the direction of osmosis or water movement, it depends on the concentration of solutes in water. So where water goes to where there's a lower percentage of water. This is 100% water. This is about 50% water. Water is now moving to where there's less water. That is diffusion. It is water is moving down the gradient is what's happening here. Now, there's three kind of osmotic conditions or environments that exist. Okay, three kinds. The first one is called hypotonic. Hypotonic. Here's some pictures that describe it. This picture describes what a hypotonic solution. So pretend this is a cell sitting in a solution. Now this is a saltwater solution. 5% salt, 95% water. This is the solution it is sitting in. The salt is the solute. The water is the solvent. All right. The cell has 75% water, 25% salt on the inside of this particular cell in this diagram. So a hypotonic environment is not what's happening in the cell, it is the environment outside of the cell. So outside of the cell, 95% water and 5% salt is a hypotonic environment. This 95% water, 5% salt, one more time, is hypotonic. Well, tonic refers to the solute, and in this case, the solute, the dissolved stuff, is salt. Hypo means, in this case, hypo means a lower level of solute exists on the environment or in the outside. So let me repeat that. Tonic means solute, and in this case, we're talking about salt. Hypo means low. Lower solute is on the outside. So let's look at this picture. 25% salt on the inside, 5% salt on the outside. The salt on the outside is lower. Hypo means lower. Tonic means solute. You have a lower solute concentration on the outside. So now, since we have a hypotonic environment, we have a lower amount of salt and a higher amount of water, 95% water. On the inside, we have 75% water. So water moves from an area where there's more, 95% moves in to balance out the 75%. Eventually, this will reach an equilibrium with its environment on the outside. Eventually, that will take place. But the whole reason water is moving is so that it reaches equilibrium and it creates a balanced environment inside and out. Okay, so another way, here's a quick tip of remembering. I tell my students this. I tell them, think of hypo like a hippo. Hippos are large. So in a hypotonic environment, the cell will actually increase in size. It'll swell up. Why? If water is entering it, the cell will grow and get bigger like a hippo. It's just a way of remembering the environment on the outside. All right. This is a blood cell in a hypotonic solution. Water enters the blood cell, and the blood cell is actually swollen in this case. Here's a hypotonic environment for plants. They want water to enter them. The water pushes against the cell wall and it keeps the plants upright. So plants want to be in a hypotonic environment. Blood cells swell up in a hypotonic environment. Water enters them. Plant cells, they swell a little bit, but the cell wall helps them stand upright. It creates pressure. Okay, so one more time. Hypo means lower solute. And in this case, our solute is salt. We have 25% here. It is lower on the outside, it's 5%. But because the salt is low, the water is higher. So there's a greater percentage of water on the outside. Water then enters to balance out the 75% on the inside. In a hypertonic environment, this is the opposite of hypo. Hypo meant low, hyper means high. All right, so this is a high solute concentration on, in this case, the outside. Now, another word for cytoplasm is cytosol. Don't let that mess you up. Cytosol, cytoplasm, same thing. So let's look at this environment. So here's the cell again, same cell, 75% water, 25% salt. This is the cell. On the outside of the cell, hyper, we have a higher tonic. So we have a 25% salt. Now we have a 40% salt on the outside. So the salt is higher on the outside. So look where we have more water. There's a higher percentage of water, 75% water on the inside, 60% of water on the outside. The water wants to balance itself out. The water now will leave through the membrane through the semi-permeable membrane. The salt cannot move. Remember, this is osmosis. We are not talking about salt moving across a membrane. We're talking about the movement or the diffusion of water across the membrane. So in a hypertonic solution, here's a way of remembering. Think of you, if you're hyper, you run around and you sweat, you are losing water. So what happens to cells when they are immersed in a hypertonic solution? They will lose their water. Here's that same blood cell. Look at it back here. In a hypotonic solution, it's swollen, okay? In a hypertonic solution, it shrinks, it shrivels in size because water is leaving. Plant cells in a hypertonic environment, they lose so much water that their actual membrane rips away from the cell wall, and it's called plasmolysis, and it actually will kill the plant cell, okay? So in a hypertonic solution, a blood cell or an animal cell in this case will lose its water and shrivel up. A plant cell will lose its water. It won't shrivel up because the cell wall is still intact, but it will die because the cell wall and the cell membrane got ripped away from each other. Okay? So water diffuses out in a hypertonic. In a hypotonic, we'll go back, water diffuses in. The third environment is an isotonic. Iso means same. So a same solute environment. 25% salt, 25% salt, 75% water, 75% water. Water can enter and leave a cell even though it's an isotonic in an isotonic environment, but the water entering and exiting is equal in pace, so there is no overall movement of water. Okay? So showing you back now, we're looking at a picture of a plant cell first. Hypertonic, water was sucked out. Hypotonic, water was pushed in. Isotonic, equal, water moving in and water moving out are equal to each other, and that is what's called, it's the same tonic. Now here's a blood cell. In an isotonic, out and in is equal. In a hypotonic, more water is entering, it swells. In a hypertonic, more water is exiting, it shrinks in size. And by the way, plants, they do not prefer an isotonic environment. They actually prefer a hypotonic environment. They like to be very full of water. Blood cells, they like an isotonic environment, in case you're wondering. Now, how do cells deal with all this movement of water? Well, unicellular freshwater organisms, these are things that live in 100% or almost 100% water. There's a lot of water on the outside. So if they live in almost a 100% water environment, water will now move into them. Water is constantly diffusing into them. So these are organisms like protista or protists, which live in like ponds or freshwater environments. So water, since it's constantly moving inside of them, which is what happens in a hypotonic environment, they need to move the water out. So what do? They pump the water out using these organelles called contractile vacuoles. They pretty much squeeze and push water out of the cell. So water goes in, they push water out. Water goes in, they push water out. Okay, this is how they deal with it. It requires energy to pump the water out. They're actually moving the water out. Now, multicellular organisms in freshwater, like for example, a fish, for example, in freshwater. Well, what happens to a fish in freshwater? Same thing. A fish in freshwater is in a hypotonic environment. Water is constantly moving into it because there's more water on the outside. Water is moving into it. So what they do, fish, for example, or organisms that live in freshwater environments, they don't move water like a pond critter does with its contractile vacuole. They don't have a contractile vacuole. Instead of moving water out, they push salts out. If they move salt out of the cytoplasm, so if they push salt out of the cell, then water follows the salt and leaves the organism that way. All right. So freshwater organisms that live in multicellular organisms that live in freshwater, they need to move salt out. By moving salt out, water will follow the salt and leave. Freshwater organisms such as protista, unicellular freshwater organisms, they pump the actual water out with their contractile vacuole. Plant cells, all right, what happens to plant cells? Well, when plant cells are in a hypotonic environment, water enters them, okay, and it creates pressure, turgid pressure, and this pressure is what allows the plants to stand upright and not fall over, all right? Plasmolysis is what happens when you put a plant cell in a hypertonic environment. The water leaves, the membrane rips away from the cell wall. In turn, this will eventually kill that cell. So this is plasmolysis in a hypertonic environment. This is turgid pressure in a hypotonic environment. Now, what happens to animal cells in hypotonic and hypertonic environments? Well, if you put an animal cell in a hypotonic environment, it will fill with so much water, and it does not have a cell wall, so therefore it will not hold itself together. It will eventually swell and burst. It'll rip open, and that is called cytolysis. Okay? In a hypertonic environment, it'll lose water, an animal cell will lose water, and it'll shrivel up in size. So eventually this cell in a hypotonic environment will undergo cytolysis and rupture and blow up. In a hypertonic environment, cells will shrivel up. Now, facilitated diffusion, we're still talking about passive transport. This just means diffusion across a membrane and using a protein. So it's going from where there's a high concentration to a low concentration, high concentration to a low concentration. So if it requires a protein, it is facilitated diffusion. That means it has to be helped or facilitated across the membrane. In this case, if diffusion can happen across the membrane, so let's pretend this is oxygen. Oxygen can go right through the hydrophobic region. Oxygen, since it's not going through a membrane, since it's not going through a protein, this is just diffusion. This is not facilitated diffusion. Here's another picture showing you facilitated diffusion. There's two kinds of proteins that do it. This is a channel protein and this is a transport protein. This actually grabs and releases. This one is just a passageway. High to low, high to low, high to low. If it goes through a protein, it's facilitated. If it doesn't go through a protein, it is just diffusion. Ion channel diffusion, this is a type of facilitated diffusion. They're just special proteins that are specific for charged particles called ions. Passive transport, again, no energy required. Things are going from where there's a high concentration to a low concentration. We will stop there.